The saloon went dead quiet when Clara whispered, "Would you take me?" But why did the giant cowboy look more frightened by her offer than by losing 2 children at sunrise? Wind hammered the red pine windows. Gideon Holt stood frozen beside an official notice, snow melting from his coat onto the floorboards. Clara waited by the stove, her small bundle already in hand. Dawn was coming fast, and Gideon had only seconds to answer. "What would you say? Tell us below." The doors of the Red Pine Saloon flew open just before midnight, and a hard Wyoming wind drove snow halfway across the floor. Gideon Holt stepped inside. He was broad enough to nearly fill the doorway, his buffalo coat white at the shoulders, ice clinging to his beard. Men around the stove knew him as the mountain cowboy who lived beyond Blackstone Creek and came to Aspen Ridge only when he needed flour, ammunition, lamp oil, or a blacksmith. Tonight, he carried no supply list. He crossed to the bar and laid down a folded territorial notice. "I need a wife before sunrise." A few men laughed. Gideon did not. He flattened the paper beneath one rough hand. 3 weeks earlier, he'd found a wrecked wagon at the bottom of Blackstone Canyon. Caleb, 8, had been trying to keep his 5-year-old sister Rose warm beneath their father's coat. Their parents had not survived the accident. Gideon had brought the children home. That afternoon, a territorial official had ridden out to his cabin and inspected everything from the flour barrel to the children's sleeping room. He was returning at dawn. Without what the notice called a stable household, Caleb and Rose could be removed. "I gave them my word," Gideon said. The laughter stopped. "I told those children they weren't being abandoned again." Only the stove answered, popping as a pine knot split in the fire. Several unmarried women were in the room, stranded by the storm or waiting for relatives upstairs. Nobody moved. Gideon lowered his eyes. Then a chair scraped softly near the stove. Clara Bennett stood. She was 34, a widow, and the seamstress who worked above Pike's dry goods shop. Gideon had seen her repairing work shirts beside the window, walking home with groceries tucked beneath one arm, sitting alone at church. Clara looked directly at him. "Would you take me?" Gideon stared. The room seemed to shrink around them. "You understand what I'm asking?" "I believe I understand better than you do." A few faces turned. Clara ignored them. "I have 3 conditions." Gideon waited. "I'll be your partner, not your property. You won't touch me unless I permit it. And those children come before whatever convenience this marriage brings either of us." There was no bargaining. Gideon simply said, "Yes." Reverend Tomas was fetched from his house through knee-deep snow. Before 4 in the morning, he stood beside the saloon stove with a Bible in his hands, while Gideon and Clara faced each other beneath smoking oil lamps. When Tomas reached the customary kiss, Gideon hesitated. He looked at Clara. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Gideon stepped back. Something changed in her expression then. Not affection. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of trust. An hour later, Clara climbed the narrow stairs to her rented room. Everything she owned fit inside one worn carpet bag and a small wooden case of sewing things. At the bottom of the case lay a folded piece of cloth. She touched it with 2 fingers. Sarah's. Her daughter had been gone for years, but Clara still remembered the weight of that little body against her chest. She folded the cloth again and tucked it carefully inside the bag. Outside, Gideon waited beside a wagon with 2 horses blowing steam into the blue darkness. They left Aspen Ridge before dawn. Neither spoke much. The storm had weakened, leaving the mountains pale beneath a clearing sky. Wagon runners hissed through fresh snow. Blackstone Creek appeared between the pines, dark water moving beneath shelves of ice. Gideon's cabin finally came into view as the first gray light touched the ridge. Smoke rose from the chimney. Clara studied the small barn, split-rail fence, woodpile, and 2 sets of children's footprints near the porch. Gideon pulled the reins. For the first time all night, the giant cowboy looked frightened. "There is something I should have told you." Clara turned toward him. "Caleb doesn't know I went looking for a wife." The cabin door opened. A thin boy stood barefoot on the porch in an oversized wool shirt. Caleb looked at Gideon, then at Clara, then at the carpetbag beside her feet. His face changed. "You got married?" Gideon climbed slowly from the wagon. "Caleb, you promised." The boy's voice cracked. Rose appeared behind him, clutching a rag doll. Caleb stepped in front of his sister. "You said nobody was taking us away." "Nobody is." "Then why'd you bring her?" Clara remained seated for a moment, one hand resting on the bag that held Sarah's cloth. She had entered the saloon believing the hardest thing she would do that night was ask a stranger to marry her. Looking at Caleb, she understood she had been wrong. The sun had not yet risen, and already their marriage had saved the children. Whether it could become a family was another matter entirely. Caleb stood in the doorway with his jaw set hard enough to make him look older than 8. Rose stayed behind him, one small hand twisted into the back of his shirt. Gideon stepped toward the porch. "Caleb, listen to me." "I am listening." The boy's eyes moved to Clara. "You brought a stranger home and called her your wife." Clara climbed down from the wagon before Gideon could answer. Snow reached above her boots. She left her carpetbag beside the wheel and walked toward the porch slowly enough that Caleb had time to back away if he wanted. He did not. Clara stopped several feet from him. "I'm not here to replace your mother." That caught him. His expression changed, just slightly. "I couldn't do that even if you wanted me to," she continued. "And I don't expect you to call me anything you don't mean." Caleb glanced at Gideon. "Then why are you here?" "Because Gideon needed help keeping you and Rose together." Rose leaned around her brother. "Are you nice?" Clara looked at the little girl. "I try to be." Rose studied her very seriously. "Can you make pancakes?" For the first time that morning, Gideon almost smiled. Clara said, "Yes." Rose nodded as though a complicated matter had been settled. The territorial official arrived less than an hour later. His wagon came up the frozen track just as Clara was pulling a cast-iron skillet from beneath the stove. He inspected the marriage certificate, the beds, the pantry shelves, and the small second room where Caleb and Rose slept beneath 2 patched quilts. Then he looked at Clara. "You came here of your own choosing?" "I did." "You understand you are now part of this household." Clara glanced toward Gideon. He stood near the door with his hat in both hands, too large for the room and somehow looking uncertain in it. "Yes," she said. "I understand." The official folded the papers, tucked them into his coat, and left with both children still inside. Rose watched his wagon disappear between the pines. Then she looked up at Clara. "So you're staying?" Clara felt Gideon's attention from across the room. "Yes," she said. The word was meant for Rose. Somehow Gideon heard it as if it belonged to him too. The first weeks were awkward. Gideon surrendered his bed without discussion and slept beside the stove under a buffalo blanket. Every morning before Clara woke, he stacked dry wood near the hearth and filled the water bucket from the creek. He never entered the small sleeping room without knocking. Never touched Clara accidentally if he could help it. Once, when he reached past her for a coffee tin, he stopped halfway. "May I?" Clara looked at the shelf, then at him. You may reach for coffee in your own kitchen, Gideon. His ears turned red. She nearly laughed. Instead, she moved aside. Small things changed. Gideon repaired the loose leg on Clara's sewing table. Clara patched the sleeve of his work coat, where years of trap chains had worn through the wool. When he returned late from the line one evening, snow thick on his shoulders, a cup of coffee was waiting near the stove. He picked it up, still warm. Clara kept her eyes on the shirt she was mending. You're late. Creek crossing iced over. You could have broken your neck. I didn't. No. You only worried everyone else. Gideon looked toward her. Clara's needle had stopped moving. Neither said more. That night, Rose woke screaming. The sound cut through the cabin like an axe through dry wood. Clara reached the children's room first. Rose was sitting upright, crying for her mother. Caleb had one arm around her, but looked helpless. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. She did not reach for Rose. You can cry, she said softly. I'll stay here. Rose cried until her breathing slowed. Eventually, she crawled against Clara on her own. Clara held her then. Only then. Later, long after both children were asleep, Gideon found Clara by the stove with a small piece of faded cloth resting in her lap. He did not ask at first. Clara finally said, "It belonged to my daughter." Gideon sat across from her. Sarah. My husband died first. Sarah followed not long after. The fire settled with a low hiss. Gideon had no polished words, so he added another log and stayed there beside her until the windows began turning gray. Weeks passed. Snow softened along the roofline. Then one afternoon, Rose came running across the cabin, caught her boot on the edge of a rug, and fell hard enough to scrape her knee. She cried out before thinking, "Mom!" Everything stopped. Rose stared at Clara. Clara stared back. Caleb looked down. Gideon stood frozen beside the woodbox. Nobody corrected her. That night, Clara sat alone near the dark window, crying so quietly she did not hear Caleb approach. He stood beside her for a while. Then he sat. I didn't know you had a little girl. Clara wiped her face. I did. Do you still miss her? Every day. Caleb nodded. So do I. They sat together in the dim cabin, two people missing different mothers and daughters for the same reasons. After a long while, Caleb whispered, I'm glad you came. Clara turned toward him. At the doorway, Gideon had stopped. He had heard every word. Spring finally reached the Wyoming mountains. The snowbanks pulled back from the trail. Blackstone Creek ran high and brown beneath the thaw. Then one afternoon, Caleb rode home from Aspen Ridge with blood on his shirt. Gideon saw the swollen eye first. Clara saw the marks around his throat. She dropped the basket in her hands. Caleb. He slid from the saddle and nearly stumbled. Gideon caught him. For several seconds, the boy said nothing. Then he looked at Clara. His mouth trembled once. Miller. Clara brought Caleb inside and sat him near the stove while Gideon closed the door against the spring wind. Thomas Miller? Gideon asked. Caleb nodded. And his brothers. Clara dipped a clean cloth into warm water. When she touched it to Caleb's cheek, he flinched. They were waiting near the feed store, he said. Thomas said you only married Gideon because you felt sorry for us. Said you'd leave once you got tired of pretending. Clara's hand paused. What did you do? I told him to stop. And? He didn't. Caleb looked at the floor. So I hit him. Gideon's fingers tightened around the tin wash basin until the rim bent inward. Clara noticed. She said nothing. The next morning, they rode into Aspen Ridge together. Samuel Miller's lumber office stood near the south end of Main Street, a two-story building with fresh paint, brass hardware, and glass windows cleaner than anything else in town. Samuel sat behind a wide oak desk when Gideon entered with Clara beside him. Caleb and Rose waited just outside the open door. Samuel leaned back. "Boys fight. 3 boys on 1 8-year-old isn't a fight," Clara said. Samuel looked at her. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Holt." His tone made the name sound temporary. Gideon stepped forward. Clara touched 2 fingers to his sleeve. He stopped. Samuel saw it. That seemed to irritate him more than anger would have. "My son said Caleb started it." "Caleb struck Thomas after Thomas insulted my wife," Gideon said. "Then all 3 of them went after him." Samuel shrugged. "Then perhaps the boy should learn to control himself." Gideon's voice went quiet. "Perhaps your sons should learn not to corner mine." Outside, Caleb lifted his head. "Mine." The word reached him clearly. Samuel's eyes hardened. Gideon turned toward the door. "We're done here." 3 weeks passed. Then Sheriff Kendricks rode up to the Holt homestead with a folded warrant tucked inside his coat. Thomas Miller had been found at Blackstone Creek with a broken jaw. His 2 brothers claimed Caleb had attacked him. Caleb had spent that entire afternoon helping Gideon replace split boards on the chicken shed. It did not matter. Samuel had witnesses, money, influence, and enough anger to keep pushing. The hearing was set before Judge Harriman. Aspen Ridge packed the courtroom. Samuel Miller sat in the front row in a dark coat. Thomas sat beside him, his jaw wrapped in linen. His brothers gave their testimony one after another. Too neat. Too similar. Each account sounded almost exactly like the one before it. Then Clara took the stand. Samuel's attorney asked whether she had married Gideon specifically to keep Caleb and Rose from being removed. "Yes." "So you have every reason to protect this boy." Clara looked at Caleb, then back at the attorney. "I have every reason to protect my son." A murmur moved through the room. But protecting him and lying for him are not the same thing. Gideon questioned the Miller boys himself. He was awkward at first, his hat turning slowly in his hands. Then Thomas said the attack happened beside the East Crossing. His younger brother said the West Bank. Thomas claimed the creek was low. Another brother remembered water over the stepping stones. Judge Harriman leaned forward. "What was the weather that afternoon?" One said clear. One said rain. The youngest looked at Samuel before answering. That was enough. Harriman separated them and asked the same questions again. The story began to crack. By late afternoon, the judge folded his hands on the bench. "I will not send an 8-year-old boy into custody on testimony I do not find reliable." Caleb's knees nearly gave way. Clara caught him first. Gideon rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. Judge Harriman waited until the room had mostly emptied. Then he called Gideon and Clara closer. "You won today," he said. "Do not mistake that for safety." Gideon frowned. Samuel Miller does not enjoy being embarrassed. Clara understood before Gideon did. This was not finished. They rode home beneath a pale evening sky. Rose slept against Clara's chest. Caleb rode beside Gideon, quiet and exhausted. No one celebrated. At the narrow bend above Blackstone Creek, Clara shifted her reins into one hand. Then she reached across the space between the horses. Her fingers found Gideon's. He looked down. This time she had chosen the touch. He closed his hand around hers carefully. Neither spoke. Far behind them, above the roofs of Aspen Ridge, a dark column of smoke began to climb into the sky. By the time Gideon turned his horse around, the smoke had thickened into a black wall. "Miller Lumber," he said. Clara looked toward town. Gideon's jaw tightened. "They wouldn't cross a road for us if our cabin was burning." Clara shifted Rose higher against her chest. "That's his choice. This one is ours." Gideon looked at her, then at Caleb. Without another word, he pulled his horse around. They rode back hard. The lumberyard was already half lost when they reached Aspen Ridge. Flames rolled above stacked boards, sparks blowing toward nearby roofs. Men formed a bucket line from the creek. Women dragged ledgers, blankets, and children away from the smoke. Clara handed Rose to Pike near the saloon. "Keep her inside." Then she stepped into the bucket line. Gideon disappeared toward the mill. Clara saw him once through the smoke, carrying an injured worker over one shoulder. Then again, guiding two men out through the side gate. Hours later, when the fire finally began to die, Gideon's face was gray with ash. Clara found him near a rain barrel. "You're burned?" "No. You're limping." "Board fell. Sit down." He obeyed. That alone told her how tired he was. For one brief moment, Aspen Ridge forgot every old grievance. Then Sheriff Kendricks arrived. 2 days later, he rode to the Holt homestead with a deputy and a charred piece of metal wrapped in cloth. Gideon recognized it before Kendricks spoke. "A trap spring," Gideon said, "with your mark." The Holt mark was still visible on the blackened steel. Kendricks watched him carefully. "It was found near the section investigators believe the fire started." Clara stepped onto the porch. "That proves someone had one of Gideon's traps. Or that Gideon was there. He was with us." Kendricks looked toward the roof, then the barn. "Family testimony." His tone was not cruel. That made it worse. Gideon went still. Samuel Miller began talking before sunset. By the next morning, half the town had heard that Gideon Holt had burned the mill out of revenge. For 3 days, Clara lived with the sound of hoofbeats in her head. Every rider on the road made her look toward the window. Every knock made Caleb stiffen. Then Pike came. After him came Warren from the North Ridge, then Amos Reed from the freight yard. One by one, townspeople gave statements. They had seen Gideon at the fire, seen him pull men from smoke, seen him arrive after the blaze was already out of control. Judge Harriman ordered the evidence reviewed again. This time, the trap spring became the crack in Samuel's story. The metal had been found above the first burn layer, not beneath it. It had been placed after the fire spread. Other evidence pointed back toward careless storage and damaged lamp oil inside the Miller operation itself. The case against Gideon collapsed. No grand apology followed. No crowd cheered. Kendricks simply rode out one afternoon and handed Gideon the cleared report. "You're done with this." Gideon folded the paper once. "Samuel?" "Not done." That night, the cabin felt unusually quiet. Caleb and Rose were asleep. Clara sat beside the stove with a cup of coffee between both hands. Gideon stood near the window. "I used to think being alone was easier," he said. Clara looked up. "Nobody could take anything from me if I didn't have anything." He turned toward her. "Now I've got you. Caleb, Rose, this place." His voice dropped. "And every one of you scares me more than winter ever did." Clara set down her cup. "Then perhaps that's what having a life costs." Gideon crossed the room slowly. He stopped close enough that she could see the pale scar beneath his beard. He did not touch her. Clara did not step away. For the first time since the Red Pine Saloon, The space between them felt smaller than fear. Gideon lowered his head slightly. Clara lifted her face. Then hoofbeats struck the frozen ground outside. Fast, uneven. Both turned. The cabin door opened. Caleb stood there breathing hard. His shirt was torn. His knuckles were red. Gideon's expression changed. What happened? Caleb looked at Clara first, then at Gideon. Thomas. Gideon stepped forward. He came at you again? Caleb shook his head. No. Silence. He said something. I hit him first. Clara stared at the boy. Gideon's shoulders hardened. What did he say? That you burned the mill. That Mama married you because nobody else would have her. That we were all liars. And did he deserve it? Gideon asked. Caleb's answer came quickly. Yes. Clara turned her head. Not toward Caleb, toward Gideon. And Gideon saw the question in her face before she said a word. He looked back at Caleb. Go wash your hands, he said quietly. We'll talk in the morning. Caleb disappeared toward the basin. When the children were asleep, Clara stood beside the stove while Gideon stared into the fire. He was defending us, Gideon said. No, he was punishing Thomas. Gideon's jaw tightened. There's a difference? Yes. Clara stepped closer. You taught him how to stand his ground. You taught him not to be afraid. But if he starts believing strength decides who deserves pain, then Samuel Miller has taught him more than we have. That landed harder than anger. The next morning, Gideon found Caleb repairing a loose board on the stable. He sat beside him on an overturned feed bucket. For 19 years, Gideon said, I stayed alive because I knew when to fight. Caleb kept his eyes down, but I also stayed alive because I knew when not to. Caleb finally looked at him. A man can win a fight and still lose something he needed. What? Who he is. Several weeks later, Thomas Miller crossed Caleb's path near the freight road. Thomas threw one last insult. Caleb stopped. His hands curled, then opened again. He walked away. Gideon watched from across the road. He said nothing until they reached home. Then he rested a hand on Caleb's shoulder. That was enough. Judge Harriman and Sheriff Kendricks continued digging into Samuel Miller's affairs. The false testimony planted evidence, threats against poorer families, and questionable business records began to form a pattern too large to ignore. Samuel did not fall in a single dramatic moment. His power simply began disappearing piece by piece. Contracts lost, favors withdrawn, men no longer willing to lie for him. Before the matter was finally closed, Harriman rode once more to the Holt homestead. At the gate, he looked at Gideon, then Clara. Kindness was never the weak choice, he said. It was the harder one. His eyes moved toward Caleb. Don't forget what built this family. 14 years passed. The cabin changed slowly. A second room was added. The barn roof was replaced twice. Rows filled shelves with books. Caleb grew into a quiet young man who thought before speaking, and Gideon still left Clara space. One November night, snow pressed softly against the windows while Clara sat mending a cuff beside the stove. Gideon cleared his throat. I love you. Her needle stopped. For 14 years, he had never said it. Clara looked at him across the fire. I know. A small, nervous smile touched his face. Do you? Yes, he swallowed. Do you love me? Clara looked around the room. At the table, scarred by years of meals. At Sarah's faded cloth folded safely in a small wooden box. At Gideon's boots beside the stove. At the life they had built, without once pretending it had been easy. "Yes," she said, "I do." Gideon did not move toward her. He waited. Clara remembered the red pine saloon, the wedding with no flowers, the kiss she had refused. Then she reached for his weathered hand herself. "There's been room for two all along," she said, glancing toward the bed. Gideon's eyes softened. That night, for the first time, they shared it because Clara chose him, not because a paper said she belonged there. Years later, Caleb married Anna in a meadow above Blackstone Creek. Wildflowers moved in the spring wind, while Reverend Thomas's old replacement read the vows. When Caleb's turn came, he looked at Anna and said simply, "I will treat you kindly. I promise." Across the gathering, Clara found Gideon's eyes. Neither spoke. Rose eventually left Wyoming to become a teacher, though every summer she returned to the mountain cabin with books, stories, and more questions than ever. Caleb built a home nearby. Children came, then grandchildren. By the time Gideon's beard turned white and Clara's fingers had grown too stiff for fine sewing, they spent long evenings on the porch, watching young feet run through the same clearing where Caleb and Rose had once stood, frightened and uncertain. One evening, Gideon asked, "Do you ever regret that night?" Clara knew which one. The blizzard, the saloon, the impossible question. She looked at the family below them. "Not once," Gideon smiled. "Do you remember what you asked me before you agreed?" Clara rested her hand over his. "Will you be kind?" His fingers closed around hers with the same care he had shown before sunrise all those years ago. Every day I knew how. Long after Gideon Holt and Clara Bennett were gone, Aspen Ridge still told their story. People remembered the giant cowboy who needed a wife before sunrise. But the reason the story survived was simpler. A grieving woman had asked, "Would you take me?" And Gideon spent the rest of his life proving that taking her hand was never the same thing as possessing it. Maybe that is why their story stayed alive in Aspen Ridge long after their footprints disappeared from the snow. Imagine standing where Clara stood that winter night, carrying grief nobody could see, and still finding the courage to risk your heart one more time. Or imagine being Gideon, a man who had survived years alone, suddenly discovering that real strength was not in holding someone tightly, but in giving them enough safety to choose whether they stayed. Their marriage began because two frightened children needed a home before sunrise. But a marriage of necessity became a family because morning after morning, four wounded people kept choosing patience over fear, mercy over bitterness, and loyalty over the easier road of walking away. Some second chances do not arrive looking like miracles. Sometimes they arrive during a blizzard, carrying old sorrow and asking a quiet question. And sometimes love heals us not by erasing what we lost, but by making room beside it for something new. If you had been standing in that saloon that night, would you have had Clara's courage or Gideon's kindness? Tell us in the comments. And if stories of frontier love, hidden wounds, second chances, and families built against the odds mean something to you, you're warmly invited to subscribe. There are more moving, mysterious, and healing stories waiting down the trail.